Trust in your character, and we are thankful for the reality of your history in the world. And we pray that we will always be ready to be reminded of how glorious and how terrifying you are, and how worthy of our love and how worthy of our fear you are. And we thank you so much that you prefer mercy to triumph over judgment. In Jesus' name, amen. So, the moment that you leave Genesis, you are now, since I attribute the Pentateuch, the Torah, to Moses, you now end up in the text of a man who is writing within his own time frame, rather than about 1,000 years earlier, or in the case of Joseph, several centuries earlier. We are going to cover a few aspects of Moses' own story tonight. We will get into stories like Leviticus and Numbers and Deuteronomy and Joshua and Judges later. Everything tonight, though, comes specifically from the book of Exodus. We are going to cover Moses' name, God's name, Moses and Aaron's staffs, and the plagues, and Pharaoh's heart. So we got a busy time. Here we go. First off, Moses' name. Exodus chapter 2, verse 10. The child grew, and she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. And she named him, that's Pharaoh's daughter, and she named him Moses, and said, because I drew him out of the water. Moses' own name is both a temporal Bronze Age marker and a nice piece of Hebrew language work. Moses' own name was a bilingual play on words from the very beginning, having a distinct relevance both to ancient Egypt and biblical Hebrew. We'll start with the Hebrew, since that's the more familiar. His name in Hebrew is Moshe, okay? Moshe, time to come in for dinner, okay? Not Moses. Moshe is the Hebrew pronunciation of the name. It is an inflection of the verb mashah, which means to draw out. That verb is used multiple times in Scripture. It's not a mystery. The Egyptian princess was probably speaking Egyptian when she named him, but her knowledge of Hebrew allowed for this clever improvisation. It is surprising, however, that Moses precisely means he who draws out, and not he who is drawn out, which is actually what happened to him, in which case his name would have been Mashwi. The sounds of words change in languages depending on how we use them. But that's true in English too, but it's harder when it's your native language to keep track of it. It is possible that the preferred inflection of his name, he who draws out, because that's actually what he did later in life, not when he was a baby. It's possible that the inflection of his name may have changed slightly later in his life by his own choice or his peers. But his name is, as the text says, clearly related to the verb for to draw out, mashah. In Egyptian, Moses' name fit very well in the nomenclature of the late Bronze Age. And this is where you do get the sounds Mosa, Mosa, okay? Rather than the sh sound, the sh sound. Though there are a couple of options for reconstructing the Egyptian element of his name. MS, just the simple ms sound, the simple combination of our M and S, in ancient Egyptian just meant boy. So, it's possible the princess saw him with a sense of ironic humor and just named him boy. And that actually remains true with the other option. Moses, a combination of our M and S and I sounds meant in an ancient Egyptian to bear or to be born, to bear a child. In ancient Egyptian of the New Kingdom, this was part of many personal names, including pharaohs and other elites. Amenmosa, Tutmosa, whom most of you know as Tutmosis or King Tut, okay? Amos, Amenmosa, Tutmosa, Kamosa, Amosa, Ptamosa, Ramosa, and even other inflections like Ramessa, Ramesses, okay? It's the same verbal root in all of these names. So Ramosa, for instance, because that's an easy one to break down, would have meant something like Ra is born. Okay? Ramosa means Ra is born, or Ra has fathered, or born of Ra. Other names could essentially be the same, just with different deities plugged in, like Amun for Amenmosa, Tot for Tutmosa, this kind of thing. But in this case, as in the possibility of naming him boy, the Egyptian princess ironically gave him a kind of half name. Moses, in Egyptian, would just have meant born of, and there's no divine element in the name. It's just born of, like she didn't know who to thank for the boy. So it's a word play either way. In any case, God has now made the name Moses mean much more to history than that Pharaoh's daughter would have ever dreamed. But at the time, it was kind of a joke. God's name, the opposite of a joke. Whew. Exodus 3, verses 14 and 15. God said to Moses, I am who I am. And he said, thus you shall say to the sons of Israel, Yahweh has sent me to you. God furthermore said to Moses, thus you shall say to the sons of Israel, Yahweh, or I am, has sent me to you. Yahweh, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob has sent me to you. This is my name forever, and this is my memorial name to all generations, the way by which I will be addressed, remembered, that kind of thing. God's name is a bit of a history mystery, and it has been the subject of national reverence, the search for spiritual relationship, and even a few mystical conspiracy theories, okay? But in terms of linguistic reality and the Bronze Age, however, God introduced himself to Moses in kind of an Egyptian way, even though the sacredness of that interaction has given it permanence, and God clearly wanted that permanence to happen. We don't know precisely how the name should sound when it is said aloud. Do not be deceived. We do not know exactly how to say God's name. Part of the reason is because the one group of people who knew it best stopped saying it out loud on purpose. Several hundred years ago, thousands of years ago. But we do have a basic idea of what God meant by sharing the name he did with Moses. Ancient Egyptian personal names can get really complicated. They often end up seeming like kind of long and tedious to modern English speakers because people's names were normally phrases. In English, Egyptian people had names like born of Ra, the river has compensated me, foremost of noble ladies, beauty of Sobek, the alligator god, that like whole phrases made up people's names, okay? Ancient Egyptian divine names were not like that, on the other hand. They were typically shorter, normally just 1 or 2 or at most 3 syllables. And that was because they might be as simple as thoughtful combinations of short little adjectives. Okay, when you put those adjectives together, it was understood that you were saying a deity's name, but what's more, the name of a deity normally related to whatever part of nature the deity represented, like the sky or the crocodiles or the sea. I'll give you a couple of sentences from their religious literature, ancient Egyptian religious literature, as an example of how these deities were named, okay? I'm going to give you a couple sentences from a text offering worship to the sea, okay? I'm going to read you these two sentences, and as I do, I'm going to repeat a few of the words in ancient Egyptian. My pronunciation will be horrible, but you'll know it's not English. But what I want you to recognize is that I'm going to say the same sets of words twice, and they're going to have completely different meanings in the middle and end of each sentence. Here we go. Straight from the ancient Egyptian text. You are complete. The word, ancient Egyptian word is kum, okay? You are complete, kum, and great were. In your name, Bitter Lake, okay, the whole name, Bitter Lake, that's the name of a god, is also Kumwur. Here's the second sentence. Behold, you are great, were, and round, shun, in your name of ocean, shunwur. Here's what just happened in your ears, okay? We use three adjectives and two completely different names, but the exact same Egyptian vocabulary. How does that work? To clarify, for each name, Bitter Lake and Ocean, the writer also used two adjectives, complete and great, great and round. But in the original language, this deity's names, Bitter Lake and Ocean, are just comprised of the adjectives, and then they take on a different meaning. It's kind of like our word butterfly. You take two words that kind of have nothing to do with each other, and then they represent something that is also completely different. It flies, but there's no butter, okay? It's a compound word that takes on its own meaning, which is a flying insect of some kind, right? The same thing is happening in Egyptian. So those adjectives put together functioned as divine names. The deity known as Bitter Lake was also named the Complete Great One. Their name for the ocean, pointing at the ocean, was also the Round Great One, okay? The sea was not just water. It was a living, divine entity with whom they interacted and of whom they were terrified. And they called it by name. Ultimately, the sea deity's name from this text was a wordplay describing its nature as a complete, round, great body of bitter water. The deity's name was both an honorific description and an identifying label. Grammatically, this sounds complicated, but it's also very intuitive. You named things as they were. Deities had fundamentally descriptive names in ancient Egypt. So how did God introduce himself to Moses? In Exodus 3, verses 14 through 15, which we read, God provided a statement, I am who I am, and then provided a name based on that statement. The statement has a repetition of a 3-consonant verb. Hebrew is hard because when you write it down, there are letters missing. There were no vowels, okay, written in Semitic languages in the ancient world. You just wrote the consonants and you knew how to say them. You'd be able to do it too with English if you tried. If somebody wrote a sentence, took out all the vowels, you'd still be able to figure out what it said. Like if somebody took the U out of but or the A out of and, you'd figure it out. But The statement involves the repetition of a verb in English, hyh, hya, which simply referred to something being or happening or existing. I am, in first person present grammar, I am who I am. The divine name God provided to Moses based on that statement was a word play on that verb, a combination of 4 consonants and a now lost combination of vowels that would tell us exactly how to say it. According to later Greek and classical Hebrew texts, we might say Yahweh. But pronunciation aside, the statement and the name share the same verbal root, hyh, yhwh. One's just a play upon the other. The purview of this deity, as Moses and all of his contemporaries would have understood as part of God's self-introduction, is that the purview of this deity with whom they are dealing is not the ocean, it's not the forest, it's not the sky. It is existence itself. And if we should understand, here's the neat part, and that's all neat, but if we do understand that an A sound was actually the first vowel in the divine name that was given to Moses, the Hebrew grammar of that name might mean that God was also describing himself as the cause of being. So Yahweh refers either to him who is, to he who is, or to the one who causes to be. In this way, God introduced himself to Moses and to Israel's other descendants in a manner that both fit with and overshadowed Bronze Age Egyptian theology. The one who is, which is, wow. The staffs. Exodus 4 and Exodus 7 both involve a staff undergoing a moment of transfiguration, okay? This kind of brings us back. Remember that when we were talking about Joseph's experience with Egyptian culture and life, we interacted in his story with 2 branches of Egyptian magical practice. Oniromancy, which was the interpretation of dreams, and he briefly mentions lacanomancy, which is using liquid in a cup to try to divine things about the world or what's going to happen. Transfiguration, the power of turning one thing into something different, was also a common part of Egyptian magical practice in the Bronze Age and beyond. And transfiguration also featured in the way that God made demands of the Egyptian royal court in terms that they could understand. Okay? God had Moses and Aaron make their return to Egypt known with a subtle, miraculous show of force, as God had done in his conversation with Moses sometime beforehand at the burning bush, since perhaps Moses also looked at the world through somewhat Egyptian eyes. But the idea of turning the staff into a reptile made sense to Egyptians, okay? Especially, and well, it's not an exception that is also true in the Bronze Age. And based on the Hebrew vocabulary, okay, Moses' staff in Exodus 4 and Aaron's staff in Exodus 7 may have actually turned into 2 different things. Let's read the English at least. Exodus 4, verses 2 and 3, Yahweh said to him, "What's in your hand?" And Moses said, "A staff." Poor guy had no idea what was coming. Then he said, "Throw it on the ground." So he threw it on the ground, and it became a snake, and Moses fled from it. I think snake is the proper word to translate there. Serpent, if you want. And then it goes on. But Aaron's staff in Exodus 7, let's go over to Exodus 7. It starts in verse 8. Now Yahweh spoke to Moses and Aaron. This is when they're in Pharaoh's courtroom. When Pharaoh speaks to you, saying, work a miracle. And a miracle is something, in biblical terms, is something inexplicable. Okay? That's what a miracle is. It's something that cannot be explained. Okay? That's the biblical definition of miracle in both the Old and New Testament. Where to go? Verse 8. Verse 9. When Pharaoh speaks to you, saying, work a miracle, then you shall say to Aaron, take your staff and throw it down before Pharaoh, that it may become and there is a different word here in Hebrew. In fact, I would argue that there is a pointedly different word here in Hebrew. Outside of Hebrew literature, the equivalent Semitic words for Aaron's reptile in Exodus 7 normally refer to a sea monster, okay? But Aaron did not throw his staff on the floor and then there is a sea monster in the room. That's not what happened. In biblical Hebrew, it could also mean a crocodile or an especially venomous snake. Like there are snakes and then there are snakes, right? And this word and another Hebrew word were actually used for cobras and adders and the really, really dangerous ones. But it's also the word for a crocodile. A terrifying lizard is what the word means at its core. And both of those kinds of reptiles, had a significant place in ancient Egyptian theology. At this time, it might especially be a cobra, because at this time, the cobra even featured as a decorative motif on Pharaoh's crown, right on the front. Some movies have actually gotten that right, but that was a real thing. That's not just Hollywood. It's called a urea. That cobra on the front of the crown. But as far as the Egyptian magicians who challenged them were concerned, they have just done something kind of spectacular with one of the important reptiles of Egypt. Okay? Right there in Pharaoh's courtroom, throne room. But as far as the ancient Egyptian magicians were concerned, the transfiguration of reptiles was not unknown, and it could go two ways. Either you could turn a reptile into a staff, or you could turn a staff into a reptile. We have records, including later classical Greek writings, about Egyptian magic practitioners making snakes and crocodiles go so rigid that you could use them like a cane or like a staff. We also have art on a lot of little tokens carved in the shape of scarab beetles. We just call them scarabs in archaeology. They look like a beetle on one side, and there's some sort of art, maybe the name of a pharaoh, on the other. But we have art on scarabs, a lot of scarabs actually, of magicians turning staffs into snakes and back. The evidence of the archaeological record then has raised the suggestion that the first move God told Moses and Aaron to make was subtle. Actually, a common display of divine power at the time. But we could also infer this from the text, right? From the reaction of the royal court. Having their reptiles eaten up by Aaron's may have been a bit of an embarrassment, and it might have been upsetting that these two Hebrews had demonstrated an ability to wield power over one of Egypt's sacred reptiles. But it's obvious from the text that neither the magicians nor Pharaoh saw any reason to panic at this point. You can do this? Fine. We can do this too. That would not stop until the third plague, but it did stop. And that brings us to the plague, which take up most of Exodus 7 through chapter 11. The significance of the plagues in Bronze Age Egypt. Remember that ancient Egypt, and we talked about this in the very first class, Ancient Egypt, like the rest of the ancient Near East, had a numinous theology. That meant that you might ascribe a divine identity to a river, or you might ascribe a divine identity to a tree, or to a thunderstorm, okay, right? Nature was steeped in divine power and agency. So many different things could be worshiped, or prayed to, or feared. But in Egypt, all of these different aspects of nature and divine power also fit into what they imagined as an overarching struggle between order and chaos. It all comes down to that. There's order and there's chaos, and there's forces of order and there's forces of chaos. It's like Get Smart, right? Remember, who remembers Get Smart? I loved that show. But anyway, their word for this all-important cosmic order was Ma'at, M-A-A-T. Ma'at. If people showed proper devotion, if all went well for the gods, if the power of the priesthood stood firm, Ma'at would be maintained and everything could be okay from day to day. The preservation of Ma'at, the protection of the cosmic order against all the forces of chaos, was one of the major reasons why you had a pharaoh. This is what pharaohs were for. This is why they were so important. They were a protective deity in the land of Egypt, right up there in the palace. He is going to keep Ma'at in place. We will not have to suffer chaos. This was the belief system of the Bronze Age people who suffered the 10 plagues. Only a handful of Egyptians ever got to hear any of the words that passed between Moses and Aaron and Pharaoh. Many people in Egypt at the time may not have even known that Moses was there. But what would have been obvious to all of them, especially the priesthood and the administration, was the fracturing of Ma'at and the failure of a pharaoh. The plagues were not arbitrary expressions of Yahweh's miraculous power to be enjoyed or feared by 21st century audiences. They also seem to have been an intelligent and thorough theological and political assault on a nation that was violently restraining the progress of his promised people. From the standpoint of ancient Egyptian belief, the impotence of Pharaoh and several other deities would have been highlighted against an overwhelming wave of chaos. The first plague, turning water into blood, implicated one of the great goddesses of Egyptian life, the Nile itself, known then by the name Hapi. Moses also specified furthermore that after that, Aaron was given to do the same thing to the rest of the water in the land after the Nile, even the water stored in wood and stone. That is specified in the text. Why were they highlighted at the end? The vessels of wood and stone. Wouldn't all their water vessels be made of clay or wood or stone? The answer is yes, but truth be told, wood and stone were the more expensive choices for producing vessels. They were harder to work with or harder to get, and they required more expertise. So it's likely that these vessels were specified because they were understood to have a special purpose. We know from Egyptian records that priests washed idols in water every morning. It is possible that God wanted it to be clear, as did Moses, that the plague was meant to extend to interrupting the ritual uses of water in the land. It's not just that people would be thirsty. Imagine if you're in charge of going to wash Anubis's body every morning and you pull the rag out and it's blood. The entire idea of purification is overthrown in the land of Egypt in one day, as well as the fact that you're going to get thirsty. The second plague, that of frogs, could have been seen in Bronze Age Egypt with reference to the goddess Hecht. She was a fertility goddess and symbolized by a frog. Hecht was normally pictured with a female body and the head of a frog. Perhaps we have in the second plague a perversion of her fertility. Uncontrolled swarms of frogs. Regarding the nature of the third plague, gnats is how it's often translated. Gnats is only a guess. Whether the critters did or did not have wings is uncertain. We may be dealing with a wingless creature since they came up from the dust like a maggot or a louse or something like that. The fourth plague, which was certainly composed of flying insects of some nature, could have been understood as the defeat of the goddess Khepri. Khepri was actually the god of resurrection, but he was also typically personified as a flying insect, as a beetle. All of these little pieces of nature, they're supposed to be under control, under someone's control, but they're not. And God is showing them that one at a time. The death of the livestock, the fifth plague, would have implicated several deities. Apis, Bukis, Mnevis, Hathor, and even Isis, the queen of the Egyptian pantheon, were shamed by the death of their livestock. Now, I didn't find anything actually that led me to associate a skin affliction, the sixth plague, with any particular deity, but I did find that afflictions of the skin at all were normally understood as a divine threat or punishment. And we see this borne out multiple times in the Hebrew Bible. Job, even Moses, when God is trying to convince him of his power, he gets a leprous hand, and as a punishment, his own sister gets a skin affliction later. This also seems to have been true in ancient Egypt. The seventh plague, the disruption of the sky with hail, lightning, fire, would have meant the defeat in ancient Egyptian minds of Nut, Shu, and Tefnut. Nut was the sky itself, the living sky, and Shu's role was to hold her up. Instead, you have hail and lightning and fire pouring out of it, and Tefnut was the goddess of moisture. Chaos. This was probably the worst hail Egypt had ever seen. Hail happens and happened in Egypt, but the climate keeps it from being very severe. In this case, it just wiped out everything that it could. And free with your tuition, this plague in Exodus 9:31 actually has a timestamp on it. In Exodus 9:21, it specifies that the barley, I mistyped a word. I put flags in my notes, but it's not flags, it's flax. Like flax. Flax and barley were the crops that were destroyed, according to Exodus 9:31. And that would place this particular plague somewhere between our March and April. So that's fun. The eighth plague, that of locusts, would have been prevented especially by the god Sanahem. But it was a basic theological expectation because swarming insects were actually a repetitive problem in ancient Egyptian history. It was expected that all gods had some duty to shelter Egypt from this kind of pestilence. They all failed. Darkness, the ninth plague, would probably have been the most disturbing to the Egyptians so far. The chief god of the Egyptian pantheon was Amun-Ra, the personification of the sun, the god of light. Pharaoh was, above all, a child and manifestation of Amun-Ra. The solar cycle was the foremost symbol of order in the world. And after all of the other gods were defeated in the eyes of the Egyptians, defeated and perverted and overpowered, who would ever have conceived that the world could also go dark? Any disruption to the solar cycle was seen as a portent of the utmost disaster. But it didn't even stop there. When the sun set every night over Egypt, as was normal, the world fell into the ominous hands of the powers of the underworld, the gods of the dead. Chief among these gods was Anubis, and one of the Egyptian deities that's still relatively well known in the modern world. Anubis is normally pictured with the body of a man and the head of a hound. He's the one that normally makes it into most Egyptian movies somewhere. You've all seen the dog man of Egypt. But Anubis was the god of the underworld, and it is in the darkness when Anubis and his ilk should have been at their most powerful and capable, that they were also helpless to stop the death of the firstborn children of the land. Moses and Aaron's real role in all of these things was to keep reminding the one person in charge that Yahweh was the facilitator of these powers. It doesn't come down to his failure against some sort of cosmic chaos. It wasn't a matter of chaos and control. There is an actual God responsible for all of these things, and he has one singular demand on the bargaining table: let his people go. And all the gods and all the control of Egypt will be lost if you do not. The best possible thing to do for the sake of Egypt in the end would be to get the people associated with this terrifying power out of Dodge as quickly as could be managed. And if we need to give them our riches to get them out the door, we will do it, which is exactly what the Hebrews ended up with. Chaos is how the plagues would have seemed to the ancient Egyptians. The last thing I want to mention is Pharaoh's heart during all of this. It would be boring and do a little disservice to the rich biblical text to simply call him stubborn. Moses focused specifically on his heart repeatedly, and he used multiple words in Hebrew to describe Pharaoh's heart. 3 of them are used in Exodus 7 by itself. In verse 3, God causes Pharaoh's heart to become hard or stiff. In verses 13 and 22, Pharaoh's heart is strong. In verse 14, his heart is heavy, but not in the sense of sorrow that we talk about today. I don't think Moses' shifting vocabulary was meant to give us 3 different pictures of Pharaoh's heart. I think he just used multiple words to give us one dynamic picture of Pharaoh's heart. Maybe, actually, a picture something like this. Okay? You are welcome to come up and see this when class is over. Okay? I'm going to turn it around. Turn it around. Okay. Mine is a reproduction of a papyrus, which now sits in the British Museum. Okay, that's what you see before you, a reproduction of a papyrus made on plant material that is preserved in the British Museum. The original of this dates to about 1280 BC. That's the 19th dynasty of Egypt. And mine pictures the weighing of the heart of a royal scribe from ancient Thebes. He's right here, actually. Anubis is holding his hand, and as he stands in front of a massive scale. On one side of his scale is a jar. That is a canopic jar that would have been holding his heart. Okay? After you got embalmed, all of your organs went into different jars. On the other side of the scale is a feather. The way in ancient Egypt that you could describe someone's heart as guilty is that they had a heavy heart or a dense heart, this kind of thing. See, in this picture, the feather is actually the lighter of the 2. It rarely goes the other way, okay? Nobody on their memorial art likes to look like the bad guy, so the feather's always gonna win. But if your heart is heavier than the feather, you are worthy of judgment and doom. If the feather is heavier than your sweetheart, good for you. Again, in the art, feather always wins, right? But here we have thought the god of Tutmosis, right? He's doing his accounting thing. Here we have Osiris telling the good news to Pharaoh. This is not the only one of these. In fact, there is a different one. There's a different scene that's on display in the British Museum. It's of this same situation, only in the British Museum ones. No, I'm sorry, the Israel Museum. This is British. The other one is in the Israel Museum. In the Israel Museum's copy, the chief charioteer of Pharaoh is the one who is being judged. And I've actually seen another one of these in Egypt. The point of all this is that this is a Bronze Age ritual imagery that was contemporary and common at the best dates that we have for Moses' own life as an adult. This matches the date of Moses. And this kind of imagery could be how Moses processed his experience with Pharaoh, whom he saw Yahweh judge with his own eyes, and then had to put into words in the years following. Pharaoh had a strong, heavy, hard heart. It must have weighed a lot. Are there any questions? Anybody? Yes. Yes. Why did they take all the organs out of the body? Okay, embalming is a very ritual process. Okay, I do not know the entire breakdown, but the body is emptied before the mummy can be preserved. Okay, you need to have, the mummy needs to be an empty shell. However, the organs were also stored with the deceased in their tombs with those who were mummified and involved, so that they have it all in the afterlife. In addition to that, they would also be given lots of food, lots of clothes. Essentially, you wanted to have everything in afterlife that you did in your regular life, including your organs. Any other questions? Bueller? Okay, you're free. Congratulations. You can come up and see this if you want.